Please, I invite you to close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember the exact sound of a heavy, iron cast pan hitting the grates of a gas stove, followed by the sharp, rich smell of melting margarine filling a cold, drafty kitchen. Do you feel that sudden, warm tug in your chest? Welcome back to the 1980s, my dear friend. Today, we are taking a slow, comforting walk down memory lane to revisit 20 incredibly cheap, simple meals we ate in the Netherlands when the household money jar was completely empty. We will explore how our mothers perform daily miracles with mere pennies. And be sure to stay with me until the very end, because I will remind you of a highly specific, squeaky sound that perfectly captures the absolute peak of our famous Dutch thriftiness. A sound I guarantee you have not thought about in decades. Before we sit down at that familiar wooden table, let us remember how differently time flowed back then. The clock on the kitchen wall seemed to tick at a much slower, calmer pace. There was no rushing, no instant gratification, and certainly no staring at glowing telephone screens while we ate. We actually had to wait for our food. We waited while the hard winter carrots boiled, and we waited while the dried beans soaked overnight. People today often look back and think that because we lacked modern technology and fancy ingredients, our lives must have been somehow poorer or emotionally deprived. But you and I know the profound truth, don't we? Our lives were infinitely richer in sincerity. The dinner table was our anchor. It was the place where the entire family gathered, shoulder to shoulder, sharing stories of the day over steaming plates of simple, honest food. Those incredibly cheap meals forced us to be resourceful, yes, but they also forced us to sit close, to share, and to truly connect with one another in a way that modern wealth simply cannot buy. Let us begin our journey with a true winter classic, the legendary Boerenkool Stamppot, or curly kale mash. Close your eyes and imagine the biting cold of a harsh Dutch winter in the 1980s. You would step inside, peeling off your damp woolen coat and your knitted scarf, instantly greeted by the heavy comforting steam rolling out of the kitchen. Your mother would be standing by the stove, forcefully mashing the steaming potatoes and the finely chopped dark green kale together in a large, chipped enamel pot. We didn't always have the money for a large, thick smoked sausage to go with it. Instead, the magic was in the ritual of the gravy. With the back of your spoon, you would carefully press a small, perfect well into the center of your green mountain of mash. We called it a kuiltje. Into that little crater, a modest ladle of salty, rich, dark brown gravy was poured. The trick was to eat around the edges, carefully breaching the walls of your potato volcano without letting the hot gravy spill all over the plate. It was a dish born of necessity, utilizing cheap winter vegetables that grew in our own soil. Yet it provided a deep, radiating warmth that started in your belly and spread to your freezing fingertips. It was the taste of home, of safety, and of a family gathered tightly around a modest wooden table, shielded from the freezing winds outside. And now, let us remember a dish that defined the 1980s for so many struggling households, the famous macaroni with smack. Do you recall the distinct metallic sound of turning the key on the rectangular tin of canned luncheon meat? When money was tight, real minced meat was a luxury we simply could not afford every day of the week. Instead, our mothers would boil a large pot of simple elbow macaroni. The sauce was a testament to pure, frugal creativity. Often just a small tin of concentrated tomato puree, thinned out with a little water, or perhaps a generous squeeze of sweet tomato ketchup. Into this Red Sea went the perfectly square, pale pink cubes of smack. If you were incredibly lucky, a handful of grated young Gouda cheese was sprinkled on top, melting into stringy, salty puddles. The smell of that warm ketchup and frying canned meat filling the kitchen on a Tuesday evening is something deeply etched into our collective memory. It was not haute cuisine, my friend, but to a hungry child coming home from playing out on the street in the fading daylight, that steaming plate of soft macaroni felt like an absolute feast. Let us turn our minds to the heavy, bubbling iron pots of bruine bonne soup, the deeply comforting brown bean soup. This was not a meal you could just decide to make at the last minute. It required the virtue of patience, a virtue we had in abundance back then. Do you remember the dry, rattling sound of the hard brown beans being poured into a large glass bowl of water the night before? They had to soak for at least flexible swelling up quietly in the dark kitchen. The next day, those beans would simmer for hours on the lowest flame of the gas stove. To give it that rich, savory depth without spending a fortune, a cheap cut of salted pork belly or a simple smoked sausage was added to the murky, thickening broth. The aroma of earthy beans, bay leaves, and slow-cooked pork would seep into every room of the house, clinging to the curtains and our woolen sweaters. A single massive pot of this thick soup would easily feed a large family for 2 entire days. The second day was always the best, wasn't it? The soup would become so thick and dense that your silver spoon could practically stand straight up in the center of the bowl. And what about the sweet, buttery magic of wentelteefjes, our clever Dutch version of French toast? In those days, absolutely nothing was ever thrown into the garbage bin, especially not bread. When the white sliced bread had become too dry and stale to eat with cheese, it found a glorious second life. Your mother would whisk a single egg with a generous splash of milk and a heavy dusting of fragrant cinnamon in a shallow soup plate. You would stand on your tiptoes, watching her quickly dip the stiff, dry slices of bread into the pale yellow mixture. Then came the unmistakable, sharp sizzle of margarine hitting the hot frying pan. The stale bread would transform, soaking up the fat and cooking into a golden, crispy delight. Placed on a warm plate, we would aggressively sprinkle coarse white sugar all over the top, watching it melt slightly into the hot, spiced crust. The kitchen would smell like a fancy bakery, masking the fact that we were eating leftovers. It was a Wednesday afternoon treat that made us feel completely spoiled, teaching us that with a little laugh and a pinch of cinnamon, even the oldest, driest crusts could be turned into pure poetry. Let us take a moment to honor Hotspot, the ultimate savior of the empty wallet during the long, dark winter months. The beauty of this mashed dish lay in its humble, cheap ingredients: winter carrots, large pungent onions, and floury potatoes. Can you still picture the sheer volume of steam rising from the sink as the hot cooking water was drained from the heavy aluminum pan? The sharp, eye-watering smell of the boiled onions would mingle beautifully with the deep, earthy sweetness of the bright orange carrots. Mashing it all together required real physical effort, the wooden masher thumping rhythmically against the metal bottom of the pan. Because meat was expensive, Hotspot was often served with just a tiny remnant of braised beef, or simply drowned in a rich, dark gravy made from the drippings of the previous night's dinner. The sweetness of the carrots provided a comforting contrast to the biting cold outside. It was a dish that carried centuries of Dutch history within its rough, lumpy texture. Eating it by the dim light of the kitchen lamp, we learned that true nourishment did not come from expensive ingredients, but from the heat of the hearth and the hands that prepared it. And now, let us remember the bright yellow cardboard box of Brinta, the coarse wheat porridge that saved many stomachs from rumbling. While we usually think of it as a hurried breakfast, in the 1970s and 80s, a thick bowl of Brinta often served as a cheap, filling dinner at the end of a very tight month. Do you remember the delicate art of mixing it perfectly? You had to pour the steaming hot milk over the flaky, dry wheat and then stir with incredible speed. If you were even a second too slow, the porridge would instantly transform into an unyielding, solid block of cement. We would sprinkle a thick layer of dark brown sugar, or perhaps a spoonful of cheap fruit jam over the top to give it some flavor. The heat of the milk would slowly melt the sugar into sweet, dark little rivers running through the pale porridge. Eating it felt incredibly grounding. It filled you up so completely that you could easily sleep through the coldest winter night without a single hunger pang. The rough texture of the wheat sliding down your throat was a gentle reminder of the simple, unpretentious times we lived in, where a warm belly was considered the greatest luxury of all. Let us recall the subtle introduction of exotic aromas into our modest homes with the beloved Conimex Nasi packets. Traveling to far-off lands was a distant dream for most working-class families, but for a few guilders, we could pretend. Do you remember the small, colorful paper packet filled with dried, mysterious vegetables and mysterious brown spices? The ritual began by soaking those dry, hard flakes in a cup of boiling water, watching them miraculously expand and release a deeply savory, spicy scent that felt entirely alien to our traditional meat and potato kitchens. The mother of the house would fry up leftover white rice from the day before, mixing in the rehydrated spices and perhaps some tiny cubes of cheap ham or a scrambled egg. The sound of the rice popping and sizzling in the hot oil was thrilling. If it was a weekend, a single crispy prawn cracker, a kropuk, might be placed proudly on the side of the plate. It was our very first glimpse into a larger, more flavorful world, yet firmly rooted in the Dutch tradition of extreme frugality. We sat around the table, feeling terribly modern and sophisticated, entirely satisfied by a meal born out of clever packaging and leftovers. And how could we ever forget the dangerous, sweet comfort of hete bliksem, or hot lightning? The name alone brings a nostalgic smile to the lips. This was a dish forged from the absolute cheapest produce available in the autumn: potatoes and apples. Half-sweet apples and half-sour apples were peeled, cored and boiled down to a mash, then vigorously mashed together with hot potatoes. Do you remember why it was called hot lightning? Because the moisture inside the mashed apples retained an incredible amount of heat. You would take that first, eager bite, completely deceived by its innocent, soft appearance, and suddenly feel a flash of fiery heat burning the roof of your mouth. We would frantically blow cold air over our spoons, trying to cool the sweet and savory mixture down. The contrast between the tartness of the sour apples and the creamy, starchy potatoes was a brilliant trick to make a meal without meat feel complete and satisfying. It was a rustic, farm-style dish that smelled of harvest time and falling leaves. Eating hete bliksem was a lesson in patience, teaching us to blow softly on our food and wait for the right moment to enjoy the simple fruits of the earth. Let us fondly look back on the beautiful chaos of Kliekjesdag, the traditional leftover day. Usually falling on a Wednesday or a Friday, this was not a specific recipe, but rather a brilliant performance of household economics. The refrigerator would be carefully inspected, and every small bowl containing 3 boiled potatoes, a single spoonful of green beans, or a lonely half sausage was brought out onto the counter. Your mother would heat up a large dollop of margarine in the biggest frying pan she owned and throw it all in together. Do you remember the chaotic, wonderful sizzle as the damp vegetables hit the hot fat? The boiled potatoes would develop a dark, crispy, golden crust that tasted entirely different from how they were originally served. We kids actually looked forward to leftover day because it felt like a culinary lottery. You never quite knew what would end up on your plate. Sometimes you get the crispy edge of a sausage, sometimes a surprisingly delicious combination of peas and baked carrots. It was the ultimate expression of the unwritten Dutch rule that absolutely perfectly good food must never, ever be thrown away. It taught us deep respect for what we had. And then there was the hearty seafaring comfort of Kapuciners met spek, often called the captain's dinner. These dark, heavy marrow peas were a staple in the pantry because they cost mere pennies and had a shelf life of years. Do you remember the deep purple-brown color of the peas, almost looking like small stones sitting heavily in the enamel colander? The magic happened in the frying pan, where tiny, incredibly cheap cubes of salty bacon were fried until they were completely rendered and crispy. The hot bacon fat was then poured directly over the dark peas. But the true ritual was in the condiments. We would dollop bright yellow, sour piccalilli or sharp mustard onto the edge of our plates, alongside some pungent raw silver onions. The contrast of the heavy, starchy peas with the sharp, acidic bite of the piccalilli and the salty crunch of the bacon was extraordinary. It was a robust, working-class meal, the kind of food that fueled sailors and laborers. Eating it made you feel strong, anchored to the table by a deeply satisfying, incredibly cheap feast that smelled of vinegar, salt pork, and honest, hard work. Let us return to the most humble hero of the dinner table, the simple broodje gebakken ei, or fried egg on bread. At the very end of the month, when the jars holding the household cash were completely empty and payday was still 3 days away, this was our salvation. Your mother would place a thick slice of dense, dark brown bread on a simple white plate. In the small skillet, a generous knob of margarine would bubble and brown, waiting for the egg. Do you remember the sharp crack of the shell against the rim of the pan? The egg white would instantly blister and crisp up at the edges, forming a delicate, lacy brown border. The trick was to keep the golden yolk perfectly intact and soft. It was gently slid onto the brown bread and sprinkled lightly with salt and white pepper. The climax of the meal was taking your knife and piercing that warm, liquid sun in the center, letting the rich yolk soak deeply into the porous brown bread. It was a silent meal, often eaten quickly, but there was an immense, quiet comfort in that warm, rich egg. It was a pure reminder that we didn't need much money to feel completely full, safe, and profoundly loved. And what about the art of making the meat stretch, beautifully demonstrated by the traditional Dutch gehaktbal or meatball? Real pure minced beef was terribly expensive, so we bought half and half minced meat, mixing beef with cheaper pork. But even that was not enough to feed a hungry family of 5. Do you recall the heavy glass jar of paneer meal, the fine dry breadcrumbs? Or perhaps your mother soaked stale rusks, the famous Dutch beschuit, in a little milk. These fillers were aggressively kneaded into the raw meat, doubling its volume. You could smell the raw onions, the heavy dash of nutmeg, and the sharp scent of dark soy sauce mixed in. The ritual of rolling them perfectly round in the palms of your hands was deeply meditative. Then they were seared fiercely in a pan filled with melting Croma margarine, turning a deep, rich brown on the outside, while remaining incredibly soft and bready on the inside. Half meat, half bread, but completely delicious. Slicing into that massive tender meatball on your plate, smothered in thick brown gravy, you never once felt poor. You only felt incredibly lucky to be sitting at that warm, fragrant kitchen table. Let us fondly remember the heavy, ripped tin can of witte bonen in tomato sauce, the white beans in tomato sauce. This was the ultimate emergency meal, waiting patiently in the dark corners of the berth. When time or money ran out completely, that tin was pulled from the shelf. Do you remember the satisfying metallic thud of the can opener piercing the lid? The thick, sweet, brightly colored tomato sauce would slide slowly into a small, chipped enamel pan, where it was heated over a gentle blue flame. We often ate it poured generously over a simple slice of toasted white bread or next to a mound of plain, boiled potatoes. The beans were incredibly soft, almost melting on the tongue without any need to chew, and the sauce had a distinct, sugary sweetness that children absolutely adored. If there were a few extra coins in the purse, a very cheap, soft Frankfurter sausage might be sliced into small rings and stirred into the red sauce. It was a dish devoid of any culinary pretense, a fast, incredibly cheap, yet deeply warm embrace on a rainy Thursday afternoon. It tasted of simplicity, of childhood, and of the unwavering resourcefulness of our mothers. And we must certainly revisit the soft, comforting smell of bloemkool met een papje, cauliflower with a traditional white sauce. In the 1970s and 80s, vegetables were not briefly blanched or roasted to a crisp. No, they were boiled. Do you remember the slightly sulfurous, earthy smell of the cauliflower boiling away until it was soft enough to be mashed with a fork? Because the vegetable alone was deemed somewhat boring, a magical transformation occurred in a tiny saucepan nearby. A roux was made from melting a little butter, stirring in a spoonful of flour, and slowly adding milk until a thick, creamy, pale white sauce formed. This rich papje was poured generously over the hot, boiled cauliflower florets, blanketing them entirely. And then came the most crucial step, the grating of the whole, hard nutmeg. The dry, woody scraping sound of the tiny metal grater filled the room as fragrant brown dust rained down upon the white sauce. That specific smell, the combination of boiled cabbage, creamy milk sauce and spicy nutmeg, is the exact aroma of a typical Dutch childhood. It made a cheap head of cauliflower feel like a luxurious, creamy delicacy. Let us now celebrate the joyous occasion of eating pannekuchen, the large, flat Dutch pancakes. For the adults, it was a brilliant way to feed the entire family for less than 2 guilders, using only flour, eggs, and a large bottle of milk. But for us children, pancake night was a massive, thrilling party. Do you recall the heavy black cast iron skillet smoking slightly on the gas stove? The pale liquid batter was poured from a cracked plastic jug, sizzling wildly as it hit the hot butter, the edges instantly turning crispy and brown. The true magic, however, was in the toppings. We did not use fancy fruits or expensive creams. We used powdered sugar, creating a thick, white, snowy mountain on top of the warm pancake, which instantly dissolved into a sweet, wet paste. Or we poured thick, dark, sticky stroop, the traditional Dutch sugar beet syrup, from a cardboard bucket. The dark syrup would slowly spread out, pooling in the little craters of the hot pancake. Your fingers would get hopelessly sticky, and your face would be covered in sugar. It was a glorious, messy, cheap feast that made us forget about budgets and simply let us revel in pure, sweet joy. And do you remember the playful innocence of a dish affectionately named blote kindertjes in het gras, which translates to naked children in the grass? What a poetic, funny way to disguise a cheap, frugal meal. It was an incredibly simple mixture of soft white beans combined with bright green string beans. The white beans, representing the children, stood out starkly against the green grass of the string beans. When fresh string beans were too expensive in the winter, we simply used the ones from a glass jar. This combination was usually boiled together and served with a generous lump of melting butter and a pinch of salt. It was a trick, of course, a way to stretch the slightly more expensive green beans with the incredibly cheap, filling white beans. But the name alone was enough to make us giggle at the dinner table, totally forgetting that we were eating a budget meal. It was often accompanied by boiled potatoes and perhaps a small, inexpensive meatball. The soft textures, the salty butter, and the gentle humor of the name made this simple vegetable dish an unforgettable part of our shared culinary heritage, a testament to how humor can make any meal taste better. Let us take a moment to remember a profound lesson in not wasting a single thing, the eating of zurezoot, or traditional head cheese. This was a true remnant of the old farm life, deeply popular among the older generations in the 1980s. It was made from all the parts of the pig that nobody else wanted, boiled down into a heavily spiced, grey, gelatinous block. Do you remember the sharp acidic smell of the vinegar and the heavy scent of cloves and pepper when the package was unwrapped on the kitchen counter? It was not a dish for the faint of heart, but it was incredibly cheap. Your father or grandfather would take a dense, incredibly dark slice of sweet Frisian rye bread, the roggebrood, and smear a thick layer of this sour, jelly-like meat upon it. The contrast between the sweet, crumbly, almost molasses-like rye bread and the sour, savory, soft meat jelly was a deeply complex flavor. Watching the older men eat this with immense satisfaction taught us a silent respect for the animal and for the pennies in our pocket. It was a rustic, uncompromising flavor that connected us directly to the hardship and the clever survival skills of the generations that came before us. And as the ice formed on the inside of our single-pane windows, we sought refuge in the deep, green warmth of real Dutch snert, the traditional split-pea soup. Making snert was never a quick task. It was a dedicated, slow ritual that commanded the entire kitchen. Do you recall the massive aluminum pan sitting on the stove, bubbling sluggishly like a tiny green volcano? The dried green split peas were boiled for hours alongside cheap cuts of pork on the bone, until they completely disintegrated into a thick, cloudy mass. The secret ingredient was always the celeriac and the pungent celery leaves, which gave the soup its sharp, earthy, unmistakable aroma. The condensation would stream down the cold glass of the kitchen windows as the soup boiled. When it was finally served in deep earthenware bowls, it was so incredibly thick that it felt more like a savory porridge than a soup. Eating it with a slice of dark rye bread and a sliver of smoked bacon, you could feel the icy cold completely drain from your bones. It was cheap, yes, but it was incredibly rich in effort, in time, and in the deep, slow comfort that only a mother's patience could provide. Let us also remember the surprising, crunchy delight of andijvie stamppot, the fraught endive mash. This was a dish of beautiful contradictions, born from the necessity to make a small amount of vegetables feed a large group. Unlike other meshes where everything was boiled to death, here the bright green, slightly bitter endive leaves were washed, chopped very finely, and kept completely raw. Do you remember the sound of the wooden spoon fiercely folding those cold, crispy, wet leaves into the blazing hot, steaming mashed potatoes? The heat of the potatoes would just slightly wilt the endive, taking away the sharpest bitter edge while leaving a wonderful loud crunch in every single bite. To make it special, tiny, incredibly salty cubes of cheap bacon were fried until they were hard as little pebbles and stirred through the mash along with their liquid, smoky fat. The contrast in your mouth was astonishing. Hot and cold, creamy and crunchy, salty and bitter. It was a masterclass in textures, achieved with the absolute minimum of funds. Sitting together, listening to the collective crunching around a small wooden table, we felt completely satisfied and at peace. Finally, let us end our meal and our journey with the ultimate symbol of Dutch thriftiness, pouring vla from a glass bottle. Do you remember the cold, heavy glass bottles of bright yellow vanilla custard or dark brown chocolate custard delivered to the doorstep? Vla was our standard, inexpensive daily dessert. But the true ritual was not just eating it, it was how we extracted it. When the bottle was nearly empty, it was never simply rinsed and thrown away. Oh no, out came the flessenlicker, the famous Dutch bottle scraper. Do you still hear the squeaky, rubbery sound of that long-handled spatula scraping vigorously against the inside of the glass? We would maneuver it up and down, twisting it expertly to gather every single remaining drop of that sweet, sticky custard. To leave even a teaspoon of vla inside that bottle was considered a sheer sin against the household budget. That squeaking sound is the pure auditory memory of our childhoods. It represents an era where we cherished every drop, where we took nothing for granted, and where the simple act of scraping a bottle clean was a shared, daily triumph of joy and utter resourcefulness. As we wipe our plates clean and step away from the stable of memories, we realize a profound truth. We do not just miss these cheap, simple meals. We miss the safety of that kitchen. We miss the unbreakable bond of the people sitting around us, and we miss the beautiful feeling of our youth, when the world felt small enough to fit inside a single pot of hot soup. Time moves forward, but these flavors and rituals will forever remain a part of who we are. If this journey brought a warm smile to your face, please gently press the like button and subscribe to our channel, so we can continue to preserve these precious memories together. And before you go, I have a question for you. What was the absolute best cheap meal your mother ever made for you? The one you still secretly dream about today? Please, leave your beautiful stories in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Thank you for joining me, and until we meet again, stay warm and hold your memories close.